cover just like the basics, the meteorology foundation, and then as you go along, as you fly, you will learn more, and the main thing for you to know about weather is like, why do you care? You know, I can talk about thunderstorms all day, but the whole point is why do you care as a pilot what the ingredients of a thunderstorm are? Well, because then you can help predict if a thunderstorm is going to happen, if those conditions are present, and that can help you determine, do I fly today or not? Mm-hmm. So that's why we talk about weather, because it's really just, why do you care as a pilot? And really it's to make that go or no go decision of whether or not to fly. I think you're required to check before every flight. It's one of the required pre-flight actions. And you just, obviously you want to know what the weather's doing, because we like to talk about how weather is super fickle, and while that is true, it's not random. Weather's never random. There's always something leading up to the results, whether it's a thunderstorm or it's a windy day. There's always conditions that you can interpret and read into, and there's data that you can kind of, you can forecast if the weather's going to be a certain type of way during the day or nighttime. So weather does what it wants, but it's also not random. So what causes weather? I do believe you should have a lesson 2 little note. Oh yeah, cool, you got it over. This is one of the questions. What causes weather? Uneven heating from the sun, just to put it simply. Heat is transferred differently depending on the terrain, the hemisphere of the earth, whether it's over water or over land. Heat just causes pressure differentials, temperature differentials in different areas. For example, on the top of a mountain in the morning, the top of the mountain gets hotter earlier than the valley does. And then vice versa in the evening, the valley cools off sooner than the top of the mountain does. That's what causes like a wind shift. When we talk about mountains, I usually will say mountains make up their own weather. It's because you have different levels of cooling and heating depending on the terrain. So mountains kind of do their own thing. If you're ever up in Auburn specifically, you can see that over the Sierras, it could be clear as day in Auburn, but if you look over the Sierras, like over near Tahoe, it's just like cumulus clouds. They're having thunderstorms and lightning, and it's because of all of that higher terrain. Truly, it does its own thing. And then in terms of why we have weather, kind of the why, is the weather is ultimately just the atmosphere's never-ending attempt at reaching equilibrium. So I wrote up there, high will always go to low. I'm talking about pressure. So high pressure will always flow to low pressure. We'll talk a little bit more about pressure in the next slide. But really that's what's happening. When you have wind, you're having one area of pressure flowing into the other area of pressure, just trying to distribute pressure equally. And that's what weather is doing, is the atmosphere is just trying to achieve equilibrium. And I put up here a resource that you should really check out. It's Advisory Circular 006 Bravo. Remember, advisory circulars are documents written by the FAA. They just provide guidance on certain topics, and they wrote one about weather, and it's like 300 pages. So I'm not saying to read it, from front to back, I'm not saying read it cover to cover or anything, but it's something that's good to have on hand to refer to, because there's just different chapters. Like there's a chapter on weather fronts, on pressure, on thunderstorms, on clouds, so you can just refer back to it, and use it as a resource to look up information. So yeah, that's a really good one. I actually think you can buy it as like a little booklet on Amazon now, because it's just so big, or so many pages. Okay, talk about what pressure is. The air around you has weight to it, whether or not you really feel it, but air is touching everything, and everything it touches, it's putting a force on it. So the pressure is just it's a force per unit exerted by the weight of the atmosphere. So the atmosphere has weight to it. So we talk about high pressure and low pressure. And pressure changes based on a couple different things. The first one we'll talk about is altitude. As you guys probably know, the higher you go, there's a decrease in air pressure. So there's less force being exerted on you when you're up higher. That's why when you go up to higher elevations, it's kind of harder to breathe, because you don't have as much pressure forcing oxygen into your lungs. And when you go up in an airline, they have to set their cabin altitude to a certain pressure level. You'll probably hear people say that they set the cabin pressure to 8,000 feet. More accurately, they're setting it, I think it's like 8.5 inches of mercury. And inches of mercury is just a way that we measure pressure, one of the ways. So it's roughly about 8,000 feet, but it's really a pressure level that they're setting it to, not necessarily an altitude. Another thing that changes pressure is temperature. So I'm gonna say this probably a lot, especially when we talk about aerodynamics, which might be next lesson. Air is a lot like water. It reacts to things the same way that water does. And if you can remember that, aerodynamics will be a lot easier for you. So just like with water, and just like with mostly anything, as the air heats up, it expands. As it cools down, it contracts. So if you have colder weather, normally the air is contracting, so you'll have like a lower pressure level. The airplanes like flying in the colder weather better than they like flying in the hotter weather, just because as the heat makes the air expand, you have less air molecules for a given volume. So like if I were to fill up my cup down here at sea level, essentially, on a day like today, I would have, bless you, I would have more air in it, same size of a cup. But if I fill it up from here versus like Lake Tahoe, I would have less air molecules in it up at Lake Tahoe, more air molecules in it down here. It's the same size, that has not changed. What has changed is the pressure level and the amount of air molecules for a given volume. Another thing that varies pressure is water vapor. So this blew my mind, but for a long time I had no idea, but water vapor is actually lighter than oxygen. So if you have a higher humidity in the atmosphere, the pressure in the air is actually going to be lighter. Which again, planes don't like that. So if you think of airplane performance in terms of weather, just know that hot, high, or humid, planes do not like that. So you'll get a decrease in performance with hot, high, or humid. High as in like high altitude, high elevation. Hot, obviously, in terms of temperature, and humid in terms of water vapor content in the air. I kind of mentioned it, we measure pressure in inches of mercury or in millibars. Mostly inches of mercury is what you're going to care about. There is one place that you will care about that is in millibars, and I will show that to you. So millibars or inches of mercury. Also, again, here's that advisory circular. Okay, talking about pressure altitude and density altitude. This is where things get heavy because we're getting into math. So when I'm talking about inches of mercury, when you get into the airplane, you start it up, one of the first things you do is check the weather with your CFI. It's called the AWOS, Automated Weather Observing System. That's what we have at McClellan. There's also ASOS, which is just like a step above an AWOS. There's also TAFs and METARs, but what you would hear on the frequency is either an AWOS, an ASOS, or an ATIS. We'll get into those later. One of the pieces of information you get from that Automated Weather Observing System voice is the altimeter setting. You'll hear the voice, it'll be like altimeter 299er2. And then you set 299er2 in the altimeter, and that little window is called the Colesman window. It's just called the Colesman window because that's the guy who invented it. So right now, for example, I can't see where the little arrow is, but I'm gonna think it's like right here. Right now it looks like it's set to 309er8, which I don't think I've ever seen it that high, so I think that's just fake. But up here it's 3021 inches HG. That's the periodic table. What is that called? The little identifier for mercury is HG. So inches in mercury, INHG. You're setting that into your altimeter, and that is so you're reading the correct pressure or the correct altitude above sea level when you're flying. So that's where you read your altitude in mean sea level, MSL, above sea level. So one concept, and this is going to definitely be on your written test, And this is also just going to be something that you're going to encounter as a pilot on your day-to-day basis. So when you get, let's say you're going to McClellan, you're flying out of McClellan, you set the altimeter to whatever the current altimeter setting is. Your altimeter should be reading within 75 feet of field elevation. So at McClellan, we're at 77 feet above sea level. So usually in the 150 specifically, she's usually about like 30 feet off. That's fine, that's within standards. Has to be within 75 feet. If she's reading like 200 feet, then the altimeter is not working, or you just set it wrong on accident. So you're setting it to 299 or 2, and then let's say you go flying and you're on a cross country and you end up flying down to the Bay Area. Along the way, you're gonna have differences in pressure level. How would you know that? Well, hopefully you're talking to ATC. That's one way of knowing it, because ATC will update you periodically on the altimeter setting of that area. Other ways is if you're using ForeFlight, which is the app we talked about last time, you can always check the weather at different airports along the way and find out the altimeter setting. I will show you how to do that. Because the pressure changes based on, like what we said, like temperature, terrain, water vapor content in the air. So what's important for you to know are two things. There's one memory item called from high to low, look out below. And then the other one is from low to high, clear the sky. What they're talking about is if you forget to change your altimeter setting as you continue going and flying through different areas, your altitude's not going to be accurate because you're not using the right altimeter setting. So if we take off out of McClellan on 3000, we're comparing all of our altimeter settings to 299 or 2. 299 or 2 is the standard pressure level at sea level on a standard day. So on a perfect day, the temperature is standard, the pressure level is standard, it'll be 299 or 2 at sea level. Standard day temperature at sea level is 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So on a standard day, on a perfect day, over at the beach at Monterey, the pressure would be 299 or 2, the temperature would be 15 degrees Celsius, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So everything altimeter setting wise is compared to 299 or 2. So 3000 is higher than 299 or 2, so high pressure. 29 or 89 is below that, so low pressure. So now we're flying from an area of high pressure to low pressure. What's happening is 4,500 feet looks like up here at this pressure level, because it's high pressure, so it's expanded. If you fly to an area of lower pressure, if you try to stay at 4,500, it actually looks like 5,500, 5,500, let's just say. I'll be more accurate. So this is a difference of 0.11. A difference of 0.01 is 10 feet of a difference, 0.1 is 100 feet of difference, so actually it's 110 feet of difference because it's 0.11. So instead of 4,500, you're thinking that you're flying at 4,611. So you're like, okay, I need to get back down to 4,500, but now you're too low because you're still using this altimeter setting. Had you set it to 29 or 89, you would still be at 4,500 feet. But because you're flying, and as pilots we're trying to be precise, you're flying, you go into this area of low pressure, now it's saying you're 100 feet off. Well, geez, I better get down. Why am I so high? Because you forgot to reset the altimeter. So from high to low, look out below, that's what they're saying is, you're gonna be flying lower than what's indicated. So you think you're at 4,611, you're actually at 4,500, according to this altimeter setting. But you're still on this one, so that's where the problem comes into play. So you're 110 feet off of your altitude, which might not seem like a big deal, 4,500 feet. But if you're at 300 feet, you think you're at 300 feet, but you're actually at around 200 feet. That could be a big difference between you flying and then hitting a tree or hitting an obstacle, because you think you're clearing it, but you're really not. So high to low, look out below. Flying from high pressure to low pressure, you're flying lower than indicated. Does that make sense? Took me forever to get the hang of this when I was as a private pilot, so if it does not make sense right now, I get it. Hopefully this little thing helps. Yes, go ahead.
Is the 29.89 and like the 30.00 like per location, like each location?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just like, we're just pretending that this is like McClellan's altimeter setting, and maybe this is like Monterey's altimeter setting, and you just forgot to reset the altimeter. So you think 4,500 feet is up here at McClellan, and then you're flying, and suddenly your altimeter is reading 4,600, and you're like, geez, I need to get down because I'm too high.
Mm-hmm.
But that's because you're using the wrong altimeter setting still. You're at 4,500, but at 300. If you reset it to 2989, it'll say 4,500. Right now it's reading 4,600 because you haven't reset it.
So do you have to like reset it like every time you enter a new area to like?
Yeah. So how that would happen is hopefully as you get further in your training, you'll start doing this. You'll get on what's called a flight following with ATC. So you'll talk to air traffic control along your flight. And usually I would try to reset the altimeter as a rule of thumb. If I'm not on a flight following for whatever reason, I try to reset it every 20 miles. Sounds like a lot, it kind of is, but that's how often the pressure can change. You know, just from here to Auburn, the elevation changes up to 1,500 feet. So, but if you're on a flight following with air traffic control, basically you're just having them hold your hand as you fly. You're just saying, hey, look out for me and don't let me hit anybody. And they're like, cool, yeah, we'll make sure like you don't hit anyone. As you switch over to different air traffic controllers, they'll say something like Cessna 61329er, contact NorCal approach on 125.1. 125.1, 61329er. So now you switch to a different frequency because you're in a different area. You check on with the new controller and they'll say Cessna 61329er, NorCal approach, Monterey altimeter setting is 29er89er. 29er89er, 61329er. So then you reset it. Mm-hmm. So they're gonna let you know when you check on, hey, there's a new altimeter setting for this area. So that's why flight following, one of the reasons flight following is super useful is because you get those new altimeter settings without having to check yourself. But if you're flying, you know, from like McClellan to Auburn, I don't usually get on a flight following because it's only like 22 miles. So instead, normally I'll get up, I'll fly, I'm using McClellan's altimeter. Once I'm within like 15 miles of Auburn, I'll get Auburn's weather and I'll change it to the altimeter setting because on the AWOS, the weather observing, automated weather observing system, it'll give me the new altimeter setting for Auburn. It'll be like Auburn altimeter setting to 3000, and you know to reset it.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay, so pressure altitude is if you were to go out to the airplane on any given day and you just set the altimeter to 2992, it'll read a certain altitude. That's your pressure altitude. So it's whatever your altimeter is reading when you set it to 2992. The reason why we care about pressure altitude really is because from that we get our density altitude. Density altitude is really what we care about. In layman's terms, density altitude is the altitude that your plane thinks it's flying at, if the plane should think. Really what it stands for is pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. So when we're talking about density altitude, the hotter it gets throughout the day, the higher the density altitude gets. Why we care about that is because I could be taking off out of an airport at sea level from the beach, but let's say it's non-standard temperature. So at Monterey, standard is 15 degrees Celsius, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. If I'm at Monterey, it's at sea level, so I shouldn't worry. But let's say it's 90 degrees outside somehow over at Monterey. The plane's gonna perform worse because it's hotter, and so the air is gonna feel at sea level as if it were at, I don't know, let's say 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet instead of sea level. So the plane's gonna perform as if it were at 2,000 feet versus at sea level. Why we care? Higher elevation, higher altitude, the airplane does not perform as well. It doesn't climb as well as it usually does. It takes a while for it to get the required airspeed for takeoff. It might not climb as high as it normally does, which means could be a concern if you're trying to fly over terrain. So I will say this probably maybe every class. You're not going to Lake Tahoe in a Cessna 150. It will not do it. Especially in the summertime, because the elevation over Lake Tahoe, I think it's already at like 6,000 feet on a hot day, the density altitude could be 9,000 feet. So the plane's gonna perform as if it were at 9,000 feet. She's not gonna fly. Or she'll fly, but not very high, not for very long. So you're not going to Lake Tahoe in a 150. So we're gonna go through some math really quick, just so you guys know how to calculate certain things. That being pressure altitude and density altitude. Just fell off. And we're gonna use McClellan's current. Actually, let's use Lake Tahoe, because that's like a better kind of like oh crap factor to really get density altitude through your head. So let me look on my phone on ForeFlight. No, I'll do it on here so you can see it. So here's the METAR. We will talk about it later, but I'm just going to tell you now. Meteorological aerodrome report. Aerodrome is a fancy word for the airport. And report means it's a nowcast, not a forecast. It's happening now. So right now, the temperature, I'm going to write this down, is 20 degrees Celsius over there. The field elevation's right here at 62, 68. I think that's all I need. Altimeter is 3009. So a couple things you have the time, 10:53. So this is 28 minutes ago, okay. The wind 060 at 4. Wind's coming from 060, not blowing to, coming from. So it's coming from the east, somewhere, where are we? So somewhere like kind of over here, because this would be east. So somewhere from right here, the wind's coming from. It's at 4 knots, that's the velocity. Visibility is 10 statute miles. So you can see from where you're standing, 10 statute miles forward. Temperature is 20 degrees Celsius, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Dew point is 4 degrees Celsius, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not going to jump into that yet, why you care about dew point. Altimeter is 3009 inches of mercury, so you would set that to the altimeter. Humidity is 35%, so it's not really that humid outside. Density altitude, 8,201. So even though you're taking off at an elevation of 62, 68, plane's gonna act like it's at 8,201 feet. So it's already getting pretty sporty over at Tahoe. So now we're gonna go back to those formulas. I'm not gonna present, I'm just gonna leave it there. So if we wanna find the pressure altitude, because we're not at the plane right now and we're not in Lake Tahoe. So let's just find the pressure altitude at Lake Tahoe. So we're gonna do 2992 minus 3009 times that by 1,000, and then we're going to add the field elevation of 6,268. So we are going to get a negative number regarding the altimeter setting. So I got negative 0.17 times 1,000 plus 6,268. So I'm essentially adding a negative number to 6,268, and I got 6,098. Okay, so that's the pressure altitude. I'm really only getting that so I can get the density altitude, because to get that, you need to do pressure altitude plus 120 times the outside air temperature, which was 20 degrees Celsius, minus the standard. Okay, pause. So ISA is International Standard. I can't remember. It's the international standard for that region. So ISA, the standard temperature in Lake Tahoe, how we figure that out. We know standard pressure at sea level is 15 degrees Celsius. The standard lapse rate, aka the rate at which the atmosphere cools down every 1,000 feet, is 2 degrees Celsius. So every 1,000 feet of elevation you get, the air should cool down 2 degrees Celsius. So if you're at 1,000 feet elevation, the standard temperature at that elevation would be 13 degrees Celsius. We're going up to 6,268. We'll just call it 6,000. We should be decreasing it by whatever 6 times 2 is 12. So 15 minus 12 is 3. So standard temperature at 6,268 feet is 3 degrees Celsius. It is currently 20 degrees Celsius, so it's very non-standard. So we'll put that there. Okay. So here we go. 6,098 plus 120 times 17. I don't know what that is. Plus 2,040 equals 8,138. So that's the density altitude. Using this formula, for flight got 8,201. As they should be within the ballpark of each other. I would go with whatever the higher one is, just to be safe. So the density altitude, based off of a 20 degrees Celsius day over in Lake Tahoe and a pressure altitude of 6,098, you get an 8,138 density altitude. Plane's going to perform as if it were at 8,138 feet. Not a good thing. Air is thinner up higher. Air is thinner if it's hotter. You get less engine thrust. I should say it differently. You get decreased engine performance because the combustion is not as powerful because you have less air going into the engine. So less engine power, less thrust from the propeller. The propeller is not as efficient either. And you get a decrease in lift from the wings. So those are the 3 ways density altitude affects you. Less engine power, less thrust, less lift. High density altitude, not a good thing, yes.
Just to clarify,
yes.
So pressure altitude is like, it tells you the amount of pressure that would like affect your flying, and that applies to the density altitude?
Yeah, so pressure altitude is just what is the pressure altitude in that area. Mm-hmm. So like if you were to park the plane in Lake Tahoe, set to 29902, it should read 6,098. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying, realistically, the only reason why you care about pressure altitude is so you can get to density altitude.
And I'll just like tell you where your plane would be.
Correct. That's what the density altitude is, where your plane thinks it's at.
Okay.
Yeah. All the plane knows is it's hotter and it's high and it feels higher, so it's not going to perform as well. That is why we care. Density altitude kills people. There's so many accident studies of people taking off in high density altitude, not taking into account the airplane performance, thinking that the airplane can outperform the weather. Cannot do that. Your plane will never be able to do that, especially single engine propeller. So yeah, that's really all I can tell you is density altitude kills pilots all the time, yearly. And it's unfortunate because a lot of the time what ends up happening is you have a pilot who's very experienced, and there are a lot of instances where it's like an airline pilot flying their own personal plane, and because they're used to the performance in the jet, it just kind of slipped. Honestly, it just slips their mind to take into account that now you're flying a single engine piston. And our engines are what's called normally aspirated, which means that the higher it goes in altitude or elevation, or the hotter it is, the engine is affected because there's less air. If you were in a turbo engine, that's a different story. A turbo engine creates its own internal pressure, so the engine will perform as if it were at sea level up to 18,000 feet. That's what a turbo engine does. We don't have that, we're not flying that right now. So density altitude matters for us in a normally aspirated single engine plane. I will be sending the presentations to you guys in the WhatsApp. Is everyone on there? We will add you. Are you on there? Are you on there? Okay, cool. Because I'll send these all the time after the lessons, because sometimes I have links to like articles and more information. Okay, fronts and air masses. So an air mass is just a large body of air that has like a generally uniform characteristics, whether it's temperature or humidity. So you have one air mass that is cool and dry, you could have another air mass that is warm and moist. And air masses can change as they move. So you could have, for example, a continental Arctic air mass, which is cold and dry. If it happens to move over the ocean, it can become a maritime polar air mass. Maritime just means it's over water. Polar means it's cold, or cooler, I should say. Not as cold as Arctic, but cooler than tropical. So these are generally where you can find the different air masses. Anything over water is maritime, anything over land is continental. Yeah, we're just talking about temperature, humidity. Is it cool? Is it dry? Is it hot? Is it warm? Is it moist? Is it dry? And why we care about air masses is because we actually really care about the boundary in between the two air masses, because the air masses control the weather. And if you have an air mass that is warm and moist, that's just lingering over the area, you could get some rain. You can get some instability. So the boundary between two different air masses is called a front. And it's one air mass is trying to overtake the other. So, and it says fronts are classified by which type of air mass is replacing the other. Understanding how the front is moving and what kind of front it is can help you predict the weather. It's how meteorologists predict the weather. It's more considered a forecast, not really like a nowcast. It's not a report, it's a forecast. So it's going to tell you the future and what you can expect. I'm going to let you guys write. But ForeFlight has all sorts of like weather imagery on there and radars and just reports on there that make it really easy to have everything all in one place. Otherwise, you're kind of checking like a bunch of different apps and a bunch of different websites, and it can get really disorganized really fast. So what's nice is ForeFlight organizes it all for you. Okay, so these are the different chart symbols, and what you're looking at right here is a prognostic chart, prog chart for short. Prog charts just provide a general general weather that you can expect through the continental US. They show you different fronts, high pressure, low pressure areas, wind gradients. They have radar data on there, so like where it's like green and purple and blue, you know, that's telling you if there's a chance of rain, or if rain is likely, or if snow is likely. And on the prog chart, you'll have different symbols that represent the different types of fronts that you could have. You could have a cold front, which means that you have a cold air mass replacing a warmer air mass. Cold air moves faster than warm, and it kind of moves like a snowplow. So you can have a cold air mass with a warm air mass, which is just like a lazy, warm blob, and you have this snowplow that's shoving under the warm air mass and shoving it up, and it's making it lift. So because you have a colder air mass shoving and lifting up a warmer, moist one, you're gonna get lift, you're gonna get moisture, and you're gonna get some instability. So cold fronts usually bring with them bad weather, like thunderstorms, showery rain. And again, it's because you're having warm, moist air that's lifting. That's when you start getting rain and thunderstorms. And those big puffy clouds. If you have a warm front, and I think of it like this, is the cold front, they look like little icicles. The warm front, they look like little suns. So warm front, you have a warmer air mass replacing a colder air mass. We don't see these quite as often because, again, colder air moves quicker than warmer air, but they do happen. And warmer fronts are usually better weather. You can still get rain, so I don't want you guys to think that you can't get rain during warm front. You can, but it's usually like a light drizzle kind of rain, usually pretty stable air, so better weather. You could have a stationary front, which means that neither the cold air front or the warm front are overtaking each other. They're just kind of at a stalemate and they're just staying there, aka the word stationary, they're not moving. And with stationary fronts, you'll get like a kind of a combination of both a cold air front and a warm air front weather. So you could get rain, but not really showery rain, just like constant rain. And it'll usually linger for like a few days. Versus a cold front, if you do a cold front, you'll get showery precipitation for maybe a day, but usually it passes right on through, it moves pretty quick. Stationary front, it's raining here for days. It's kind of foggy for days. You have like overcast layer that just hangs around. So you have a stationary front, just expect to have, you know, some rain that just might linger there for a couple days. And then you have a occluded front, which is a cold front overtaking a warm front. So not just an air mass overtaking another, you literally have a cold front overtaking an already established warm front, or a stationary front. Lots of instability, lots of rain, poor weather to fly in. Yeah, it's kind of, I would say it's like a kind of a, I wouldn't say it's a more intense cold front, but it's very unstable. And normally, if you see a stationary front where it's like the combination of the two, if you check the prog chart in a couple days, you'll see it start turning purple because the cold front just kind of naturally starts overtaking it. So you have a composite of two fronts. It's a cold front overtakes a warm front. You could have a warm front overtake a cold front, but it's not likely. Prog charts make sense, or I'm sorry, fronts make sense. This is a prog chart. Do I want to dive into that? Yeah, we'll dive into it. Okay, so I'm going to open Vorklight. Okay, so here's what it looks like in real time. You have a lot of symbols on here. What's great is you have a legend right there too, and for the radar return. So you have the light green, there's a chance of rain. If it's dark green, you're likely going to have rain. These like cross hatches with the red border, there's a chance of a thunderstorm. If it's like a dark red, which I don't see right now, it would be like where the green is, but red. That means it's a likely and or severe thunderstorm. But we have a couple of things on here. So looks like we have a warm front right here, kind of a stationary front because it's that combo, but it's mostly a cold front up here. We got a bit of a stationary front right down here as well around Texas. Got lots of rain and weather over like in Florida and such. These L's and these H's, low pressure, high pressure. I don't know why the H is blue and the L is red. It should be the other way around, but it's not up to me. So you have high pressure in this area, you have low pressure in this area, then you have all these random numbers that begin with a 10. That's pressure in millibars. So this is where the millibars comes in. Usually we're in inches of mercury, but prog charts, they put it in millibars. And I think millibars are what's more commonly used around the world. Because the United States, we're famous for making up our own numbers. So on the prog chart, you have the millibars. 1013 is standard. So 1013 is like R2, 9, or 9, or 2. So anything above 1013, like right here, 1016, high pressure. So you have that little H right there. Anything below 1013 is low pressure, 1009, 1009, 1012. So we have that low pressure area. This dashed orange line is an elongated area of low pressure called a trough. We get that a lot in the valley. With the trough, it's so common. I don't want to say like it really causes a lot of weather, but just in general, low pressure, you can typically get poorer weather if it's moist enough, which right now it's not. So right now we don't really notice anything. But in the wintertime, when we have more moisture in the air, that low pressure is probably going to cause like big puffy clouds, cumulus clouds, thunderstorms, windy days. Right now it's pretty calm, but we have had some windy days lately, and it's probably because of this low pressure area. And you're having these high pressure areas flow into the low pressure area, so that's where you get the wind. The wind is just one area of pressure flowing into another because the weather is trying to reach equilibrium. These black bars are called isobars. These are areas of equal pressure. So like this whole line, for example, in theory is 10, 12 millibars of pressure. When you get them close together like this, that means you have a lot of areas of equal pressure close together, but they're different. So you have 100 here, you have 1004, you have 1008, you have 1009. So you have a lot of different pressures close together, You get windy days when you have those isobars so close together. Right now, we're not, I mean, it's kind of close right there, so it might be windy along the coast, which is pretty normal. But I don't see one that's nearby, so it seems pretty calm winds today. And when we checked Lake Tahoe weather, it was only, I think it was like 4 knots, so that kind of checks out. This goes even further into the future. I believe it goes up to 3 days in the future, so I like looking at prog charts when I have a flight in 3 days because I can kind of start predicting like frontal movement and what weather to expect. And if there's like a radar return over California, if there's like thunderstorms likely in the area, I might need to consider, you know, canceling my flight, moving things around. Have an occluded front at any point. Still a stationary front here. You can see that rain, it's still there. It's just gonna linger there for a couple days probably because it's stationary. Not really further developments now. So that front up here becomes a stationary front. Now it's down here. And generally in the northern hemisphere, which is where we are, you get weather moving from west to east. Because the ocean's over there, so weather always comes from the ocean. Good? Cool? Talking about thunderstorms, the 3 ingredients for a thunderstorm is instability, a lifting action, and moisture. You need all 3 of those to have a thunderstorm. You need the instability so that you can have this, we like to call it a parcel of air. So like, just imagine just this little bag of air, of warm, moist air. It needs to lift in order to create a cloud. So you need instability so that this parcel of air has the ability to lift. And then you need a source of lift. This could come from different things. It could come from a change in air density. So air density changes due to temperature, changes due to terrain, so like up in the mountains. You have a lot of lifting action over in the mountains because you have the tip of the mountain, which, you know, in the morning is hotter than the valley. So because you have that hotter air up here, normally, yeah, you have the hotter air and then you have the colder air down here. You have the wind that starts shifting to try to equalize. That could be a source of lift for that little parcel of air to continue lifting and developing. And as that warm air lifts, it cools down, it condenses, the energy from the condensation warms it back up again so it can continue to lift, and the whole thing happens over again. It cools down, it condenses, the heat from the condensation causes it to keep lifting. And as it condenses, it's creating visible moisture, aka a cloud. So that cloud with vertical development keeps forming until it can't warm up anymore. So until it reaches the top of the atmosphere to where it no longer can get warm enough and it just reaches its cooling point and it stops, that'll be the top of the cloud. But as it continues lifting, you get those cumulus clouds that are really tall, especially over like the Sierras. And you have to have that moisture element because it needs to form that cloud. And then the cumulus cloud becomes a cumulonimbus cloud, which just means a cumulus cloud with rain. And then you get thunderstorms. There's a lot of energy in those clouds. And if you have a thunderstorm, you're gonna have lightning. There's a lot of debate about like really what the cause of lightning is. A common thought or a common theory is that you just have like a lot of, I'm not the person to be asking for this, but I think it's like you have a lot of like electrons that are just like moving really fast past each other, and they're caught in that friction is what creates that kind of electricity and that causes that lightning. Don't quote me on that. I'm not a meteorologist, but I can tell you when it comes to flying around thunderstorms, the rule of thumb is to maintain a distance of at least 20 nautical miles away from it. And that's just because there's different phases of a thunderstorm. So you have the developing phase, you have the mature phase, and you have the dissipating phase. The first phase, the developing phase, is also called the cumulus phase because that's when you start getting cumulus clouds. You get a lot of updrafts, which just means you get a lot of wind blowing up. So you have all that energy that's just focused on building this cloud. It's just pushing everything up, it's lifting. Then you have the mature phase, which is classified by rain. and hail. So you'll get a mixture of updrafts and downdrafts, just a lot of chaos. And then you have the dissipating phase, which continues with the rain. This is when the thunderstorm kind of starts breaking apart and dissipating, as the phase is called. That's characterized by a lot of downdrafts. So the wind shifts direction several times during a thunderstorm. We care about that because it can cause situations such as wind shear. Wind shear is a sudden change in wind speed and direction. This can be very dangerous, especially during takeoff and landing. You take off into a headwind, suddenly it shifts into a tailwind. Planes are made to fly into headwind. The plane aerodynamically is built to take off and land into a headwind. If it suddenly shifts into a tailwind, a headwind lifts up the nose, tailwind will push the nose down. You can probably guess that's not ideal when you're trying to take off. You also get something called a microburst. A microburst is just a form of wind shear. It's an extreme downdraft. And when I mean extreme, I mean it can make you descend at a rate of 6,000 feet per minute. We usually climb at about 500 feet per minute, so we cannot outclimb a microburst. So it's literally going to shove your plane down. Then you have turbulence, which we're all kind of familiar with, in the regular motion of the air. It's what freaks people out during if you're flying on the airlines. But it's normal. It's very normal. And there's different classifications of turbulence intensity. You have light, which just means if you're flying and it's light turbulence, you might just have like the needle, the altimeter might just move kind of like this. It's very small, very I don't want to say negligible, but just very slight erratic changes in your airspeed and your altitude. Nothing that makes you lose control though. And then you can have moderate, which means that you're going to get some changes, like 100 feet per minute, 200 feet per minute changes in altitude. You're going to feel a slight strain against your seatbelt, but you remain in control at all times. And then you can get into severe, which you have large and abrupt changes in altitude. You get drops and you get really big climbs that are not under your control, and you momentarily might be out of control. Anything that's not buckled down in the plane is going to fall off the seat, it might fly around the cabin. And if you have extreme, in our case in 150, you're probably going to lose a wing. Like, it's bad. You do not fly into severe or extreme turbulence as a Cessna 150. Light and moderate are your limitations. I'm not saying that that's not a formal limitation. I am just telling you, as a pilot to pilot, you're not flying in severe or extreme. Light and moderate are your limits. Wind shear can be caused by 4 different things. So it can be caused by frontal activity. So you got a cold front, you got an occluded front. Usually those two. Not typically like a warm front or a stationary front. They can be caused by thunderstorms. They can be caused by temperature inversions, which just means normally as you go higher, the air cools down. During a temperature inversion, if you go higher, the air gets warmer. Also surface obstructions. So over at Auburn, wind shear is very common because the runway is very close to all the hangars. So as the wind is blowing across the surface, it's shifting directions constantly because it's moving through the hangars and the different rows of hangars and the planes and the buildings. So the wind up at altitude and the traffic pattern could be pretty straightforward, but when you get down to land over at Auburn, the wind halfway down the runway changes. So landing at Auburn is kind of tricky for that reason. Not so much McClellan. McClellan's wide, it's long, all the hangars are very much offset away from the runway, so whatever the wind is saying in the pattern or on the AWOS is pretty much what it is. But at Auburn, it's like a running joke, like the wind's, whatever it's saying the wind is, it's probably wrong. And unfortunately, it's just limited to where like the weather antenna is. The weather antenna is saying, hey, the wind over here is 270 at 10. Okay, well the windsock over here is telling me it's like 250 at 20. That's just Auburn. There's also a bunch of terrain near Auburn, so all sorts of things can shift the turbulence. So that's called mechanical turbulence if it's affected by what's on the surface. Our concern as pilots with wind shear, takeoff and landing specifically. if it shifts from a headwind to a tailwind, that's very bad. If it shifts from a tailwind to a headwind, that's a little better, because like I said, the planes take off and land into the wind, so a headwind would actually, you know, give it more lift. Tailwind would decrease the lift. Atmospheric stability. So we care if the atmosphere is stable or unstable, because that's going to tell us how smooth the ride is going to be. Some indicators of stability would be clouds. Clouds with vertical development, specifically. If you have big puffy clouds in the sky, you can kind of guess that the atmosphere is unstable. Because if it's unstable, that means things have the ability to lift. And then if you have enough moisture, you can get a thunderstorm from that. Precipitation. If there's precipitation, it's because there's clouds up in the sky that can't hold water anymore. That could have only happened if the atmosphere was unstable. And then the lapse rate. We talked about the standard lapse rate, which was 2 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 feet. If it's cooling down faster than that, that's an indication of instability. If the air is rapidly cooling, that means something is happening. And this is your little fake parcel of air that lifts. I have a note here. It says, atmospheric stability is the property of the surrounding air that either encourages or discourages vertical motion of air parcels and determines which type of clouds and precipitation a pilot will encounter. So what that means is if the air is stable, it's discouraging lifting action. That doesn't mean you won't get clouds, but the clouds you're going to get are like stratus clouds, which are very flat, very stable. If you fly around stratus clouds, it's very smooth air. Or if you have instability, that's encouraging vertical motion, so you're going to get those big cumulus clouds, and you're going to get a bumpy ride, you're going to get turbulence. On that lapse rate note, I should also say if the lapse rate is slower than normal, that's an indication of stability. It means the air is cooling down a little slower, so there's not a whole lot of activity in the atmosphere, so it's going to be generally pretty smooth. Types of clouds, we've been talking about them, but here they are. Cumulus clouds, lots of vertical development. They're going to be turbulent because you have unstable air surrounding them. If you fly into them, it's very possible, it's very likely that you're going to pick up ice. If you pick up ice, that's very bad. Because if the ice sticks to the aircraft, it's changing the shape of the wing. And now you don't know how the wings or how the plane's going to react aerodynamically. It increases the weight of the aircraft. It also increases your stall speed, which means you're going to stall earlier than you normally would. If you ever fly and you notice that you're picking up ice, either on the wings or on the struts or on the pitot tube, first of all, turn on the pitot heat. Hopefully there's not enough ice to where it can't be burnt and it can't be melted off. Turn on the carb heat so you don't get icing in the carburetor, which could cause an engine failure. And pick a long runway because you're going to land with no flaps. Because what could happen is if you pick up ice on the tail of your wing, if you deploy flaps, that changes the airflow, and now the way it strikes the tail, it's going to hit it differently. And you could actually stall the elevator, or you could stall the tail. And if you stall the tail, the plane's not going to fly. And how to get out of a tail stall is the opposite of how you get out of a normal stall. In a normal stall, you push forward to recover. For a tail stall, you pull backwards. So if you're not proficient in recovering from tail stalls, and that ends up happening to you because you decided to fly in icing and then deploy your flaps, you might reactively do the wrong thing. So if you're gonna fly and you pick up ice, pick a long runway, land without flaps so you don't risk a tail stall. Also, you just want to keep up your airspeed in general to stay away from the stall speed. You have stratus clouds, which are flat and stable, smooth air. You can still pick up ice if you fly into them, it's possible. But they're partially made of ice crystals, so it's a little bit less likely. Because if it's already in the form of ice, it's not going to stick to the plane. Then you have cirrus clouds. I didn't know the scientific term, so I said wispies. They look wispy. wispies like in the sky. I think they're also called like horsehair or I don't know. There's different words for what they look like. But smooth air, no icing because cirrus clouds are completely made of ice crystals, so they will not stick to the plane. And usually, if you have a cirrus cloud or cirrus clouds in the sky, that's an indication that there's a change in weather coming up. So those are the 3 different types of clouds that you're going to come across. We're not seeing too much cumulus clouds yet because it's still hot outside and it's still pretty stable, but we're getting there. And you can still see them over the mountains. Okay, so now we're on to weather regulations because there are depending on the airspace you're in, you have to maintain a certain separation from clouds. And this is all under the Part 91 regulations. This one specifically is 91-155. And anytime I point out like a regulation, highlight it, write it down, circle it, refer back to it later. Because if you have your FAR-AIM, your Federal Aviation Regulations textbook, I would go and find it and tab it. Because I'm pointing it out because it's something that you're gonna have to refer back to at some point. VFR weather minimums are a very big topic, and they kind of, when you talk about airspace, you're probably gonna have to talk about weather minimums. So, you have different classes of airspace, and I'm not gonna get into like airspace specifically, but you have A, B, C, D, and E, and you have G. We skip F. I think in other countries there is an F airspace, but not in the continental US. So most of the time you're going to be operating in class Echo. And the reason why a lot of people from outside of the US like to come and flight train in the US is because we have like the most successful class Echo in the world. Our class Alpha, it's not on here because you cannot fly VFR into Alpha. Alpha is IFR only, so IFR is instrument flight rules. You cannot fly into Alpha. Our Alpha starts at 18,000 feet. In other countries, like in Europe, I don't know which specific countries in Europe, I think Germany might be one of them, but in other countries, the class Alpha starts at 4,500 feet. So it's not a whole lot of room for us to be flying and training. So that's why a lot of people come across and do their training in the US. So as you get into more restricted airspace, like a Charlie or a Delta or a Bravo, you'll notice the Bravo, you only need to be able to see visibility 3 miles, and you just need to remain clear of clouds. That just means the cloud could be right next to you, but as long as you're not touching it, you're fine. In an Echo, most of the time you guys are going to be in an Echo below 10,000 feet, so you need 3 miles of visibility. You need to stay 500 feet below clouds, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontal distance. So if that show up as a cloud, I need to be 2,000 feet away from it. The limit is less in the Bravo because you're talking to air traffic control, because you don't have a choice. You have to be talking with ATC if you're in the Bravo. They're going to make sure you don't hit anything, so that's why the limitations are a little bit lighter. Otherwise, if you're in an Echo, you don't have to talk to anyone, so maintaining visual separation from clouds is up to you, so they require more. How do you know if you're 500 feet above or 1,000 feet below? Sometimes it's really hard to tell. You're just like, that looks about right. But usually what you could do is if you're taking off, let's say out of McClellan, and the weather report is saying that you have 2,000 foot ceilings, which means that the base of the cloud starts at 2,000 feet. And that is AGL. Cloud reports are in AGL, which means above ground level. So not mean sea level, but above ground level. So if you take McClellan, which is 77 feet above sea level, and you got a 2,000 feet cloud, on your altimeter at 2,077 feet is when you're going to hit the cloud. So, could you find the traffic pattern? If the clouds were at 2,000 feet at McClellan, we're in class Echo in McClellan. Yes, you could, because you're maintaining 1,000. You can maintain 1,000 feet below in the traffic pattern over at McClellan. So yeah, you can go in the traffic pattern, that's fine. Let's say you want to go outside of McClellan because you're going, I don't know, on a cross country somewhere. And you notice like, hey, well, if I go towards Lincoln, there's just like a big hole of blue sky that I can comfortably fly through. Okay, great. You take off, you can maintain below the clouds without being unsafe, and then you get into that blue hole, you climb above the clouds. It's really cool to do. It's really easy to do over at Auburn or like any like Grass Valley Airport, or I'm sorry, not Grass Valley, Nevada County Airport, because normally when we get fog in the fall in the valley, it's called Thule fog, it is not able to climb up those mountains. So Auburn will be like VFR, and then McClellan will be like IFR or low IFR. So if you take off out of Auburn, you're well above the fog layer, and you can fly over the fog comfortably, and it's a really cool thing to see. Obviously, you have to land back at Auburn. You couldn't land like anywhere in the valley. But so if McClellan is reporting a 2,000-foot ceiling, you take off, you climb through that hole. You know, based on the weather report, at McClellan, the ceiling was a 2,000. So as long as you're flying at 3,000 in an echo, you're fine. So that's one way of telling, is by looking at the airports and looking at what ceilings they're reporting to find out, okay, I'm over this area. The nearest airport is Lincoln. Lincoln's reporting a 3,000-foot ceiling, so the clouds are a little bit higher, so I need to be a little bit higher to maintain that separation. So like that's one way of doing it. Other ways are if you're talking to air traffic control. A lot of the time pilots will make reports and they'll say, hey, just so you know, like I entered the clouds at 3,000 feet, I broke out at 4,000 feet. Okay, air traffic control will keep a note of that, and for any other pilots in the area, they'll be like, hey, just so you know, I had another pilot, they reported that they broke out of the clouds at 4,000 feet. Oh, okay, so below me is 4,000 feet, let's say I'm at 4,500, okay, I should probably climb, because that one pilot who was in the same area told air traffic control that he broke out at 4,000 feet. So now I'm gonna assume they're all at 4,000 feet and I'm gonna go higher. So this is 91-155. You can read more about it in the AIM as well, chapter 7 in the AIM. But this is going to be the bane of your existence when you start studying this more, because it's just a lot of different numbers to remember. If you're good at remembering numbers, then good for you. I am not, so this was hard. But just know the higher you go, or the more restricted airspace you go into, the minimums tend to be lighter. The higher you go, so like if you're at 10,000 feet or above, for example, in the echo, now they require more visibility, more cloud separation. That's because you're up there with the big boys. Everyone's flying faster, planes are bigger, because you're above 10,000 feet, so that's where all the fast people go. So you need more clearance from the clouds, because if a jet is flying in the clouds, they want to make sure you have enough reaction time to get out of the way. So if they just pop out of the clouds and you're only 5 or 1,000 feet above them, that's not a whole lot of reaction time. So they want 1,000 feet above, 1,000 below, 1 statute mile horizontal. So it goes from 2,000 feet to 1 whole mile. So when you're talking about weather, you're gonna have to have this conversation with your CFI, establishing personal minimums. Personal minimums just means that you have your own set of regulations and procedures and rules that you abide by. It might be tighter than the legal regulations, but that's usually what you want. Because just because it's legal does not mean it's safe. So it's your own set of rules that you created for yourself to keep yourself safe. The minimums in a class echo are 3,152, 3 miles visibility, 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontal. A common memory phrase is 3 152s. 152 is a type of plane, so you have 150, 152. So 3 152s. You might want more than that. You might say, I'm not taking off if the visibility is less than 7. I want the ceiling to be at least 2,000 feet above me. I want to be able to maintain at least 2,000 feet above the cloud, and I want to maintain at least 4,000 feet horizontally. So you're keeping yourself safer by giving yourself tighter restrictions. And again, that's something that you talk about with your CFI, because your CFI is going to be the one flying with you. They're going to know like how well you perform. We can kind of gauge like yes, you can handle a 7 knot crosswind. With you, I'm gonna give you a 5 knot crosswind limitation. And it just depends on how comfortable you are. We're not saying like one person's better than the other. It just also depends on the situations that you've been in with your CFI. If the winds just haven't been much of a crosswind, you don't have as much crosswind experience, so I'm going to give you less of a crosswind to have on your own. Whereas if I've been flying with this other person and we primarily fly in the afternoon and we primarily fly out of Auburn, they have a lot more wind experience than you might, and so I might give them a little bit bigger of a crosswind component because I know they can handle it, because I know we've been in that situation before. So like for example, my students out of Auburn, I tend to give bigger crosswind component limitations to them versus my students out of McClellan. Just because you're flying out of a 10,600 foot runway, 150 feet wide, flat, low terrain. The winds generally aren't that nasty at McClellan. Up at Auburn, different story. 3,700 foot runway, I think it's only 75 or 100 feet wide, surrounded by terrain and hills, a lot more turbulence and wind over there. If I have a student that can land and take off out of Auburn comfortably, yeah, I can give them more crosswind component. Crosswind component just means if I'm landing going this way, and you have wind coming from either here or here. So the more crosswind you have, like the wind's coming from this direction, it's not coming down the runway, it's coming from across it. It's more challenging to land into a crosswind, so your CFI will give you a crosswind limitation when you solo. And you legally have to stay within those standards. If it's outside of those limitations, you cannot fly, because that's what your endorsement says. And then when you get your private pilot certificate, I typically tell students, whatever limitations I gave you, have that be your first set of personal minimums. When you're ready to expand your horizons and you want to fly on a windier day, go up with the CFI or go up with a more experienced pilot and expand your minimums with someone. You can totally do that. What you cannot do is you cannot expand your minimums the day of just because you're like, well, my crosswind component limitation that I gave myself is 7 knots, but today it's 8 knots. I'm sure it's fine. It's like, no. Go up with someone if you can, and then expand your minimums with them. Don't go by yourself, not ever having the experience of doing it on your own. And that'll keep you alive. Because a lot of people, they have their personal minimums for their check ride and then they completely forget about them. There's an article about personal minimums. AOPA literally has like a worksheet you can fill out with your CFI where you can write down your personal minimums. You sign it like it's a contract, then you have it on paper. It's a lot harder to ignore it if it's written down. So I highly recommend checking out the article, printing it out, working on that with your CFI when you're at that stage. And then like having it in your logbook. And then when you sign it, treat it like a contract. Some of you are gonna go into flying as a career. There are company standard operating procedures and policies that you cannot ignore, you can't exceed. They have crosswind limitations, they have temperature limitations in the airlines that if it's over a certain temperature, you can't fly. You literally are grounded, like you cannot take off legally. So you might as well treat your personal minimums like a company policy. And you're working for yourself, but that way you're training yourself to treat it seriously versus just forgetting about it later because like no one's watching you. And that's the hard part when you're a private pilot, is no one's really watching you anymore. Talked about METARs and TAFs. So METAR, Meteorological Aerodrome Report. It's the nowcast. This is what's happening within the hour. They're issued every hour. They're different than an AWOS, ASOS, or ATIS, but they are formatted the same way. And they give you generally the same information. So the METAR is like kind of the more up-to-date information. It'll tell you the temperature, it tells you the winds, the altimeter setting, it'll tell you where the ceilings are, what the visibility is. And then you have a TAF, Terminal Aerodrome Forecast. It's telling you the weather in the future. It tells you the expected conditions within a 5 statute mile radius from the center of the airport over a 24-hour period. So they're issued every 24 hours, 4 times a day. And they're issued by humans, people who are actually looking outside with their eyeballs. So they tend to be a little bit more accurate than METARs. METARs are more up to date, but TAFs can be more accurate because it's actually a person looking outside. Not every airport has a weather reporting facility. So if you ever go to one without one, you would just check an airport that's nearby. This is ForeFlight, by the way, if I didn't mention that. So it's your VFR sectional chart, it's your weather reporting, flight planning stuff. Alright, so here's the METAR from McClellan. So here's the raw code, which you're going to have to learn how to interpret. It's a METAR. The airport is KMCC, McClellan. The time or the day is the 14th of the month, 14, and then 1855Z, 1855 Zulu time. So Zulu time is the universal time. All it is the time in Greenwich, England. But it's just, it gives everybody a baseline to start from the same spot. Because, there's time zones. So like 5 p.m. here is different than 5 p.m. somewhere else. But Zulu time is the same. So right now, to convert Zulu time to local time, you have to be familiar with military time. So right now we're in daylight savings. So because of that, you're going to take 1855 and subtract 7. If you're not in daylight savings, you subtract 8. So 1855 minus 7 is 1155. 1155 military time just happens to be 11:55 a.m. And it even says it right here, 11:55 a.m. So ForeFlight decodes it for you. However, on the check ride, the examiner could ask you, he could just present, or she could just present the raw code and be like, can you read that? Without cheating. So you have to learn how to interpret the data. So the Zulu time is 11:55 a.m. local, PDT. Auto just means it's automated, so that's always going to be there. VRB means variable. That's talking about the winds. The winds are variable at 4 knots. It just means that the wind is shifting direction too much that it really doesn't have a solid direction it's coming from. It just keeps shifting. So variable at 4, it says it down here. 9 SM, 9 statute miles visibility. It's a little hazy outside. Normally it's 10 statute miles, but today it's 9. Okay, that's fine. CLR, sky clear. There's no clouds. 28/10 is the temperature and the dew point. We care about temperature and dew point because what the dew point is the temperature at which the air becomes saturated with moisture. So when I say saturated, I mean if you think about like a cotton ball and you keep dropping water on it, at some point it can't hold water anymore and it starts dripping. Same thing happens with the atmosphere. You have the dew point 10 degrees Celsius and the temperature 28 degrees Celsius. The difference between the two is called the temperature dew point spread. The closer those two are together, the closer the atmosphere is to the saturation level. So if the temperature cooled down to 10 degrees Celsius, and so temperature is 10, dew point's 10, you're going to get fog, you're going to get clouds, you're going to get rain, you're going to get some sort of visible moisture. Or if the dew point warms up to the temperature, same thing happens. So either the dew point warms up or the temperature cools down. The baseline is if they meet, if they're like the same or very close, you're going to get visible moisture because dew point is where the air becomes saturated. It cannot hold the moisture anymore. It has to release it somehow, whether through fog or rain. So right now they're pretty far apart. So the air is pretty dry, and you can kind of tell that because the humidity is 32%. So it's pretty dry outside. We don't have humidity presented in here. That's just, I don't know, that's like an extra thing that ForeFlight gives you. The next thing, so that's 2810, temperature dew point. A 2982. A is altimeter, 2982 is the altimeter setting, so it's relatively low pressure right now. And then RMK is your mark. And what it's referring to is the Alpha Oscar 2. Alpha Oscar 2 is a code. You could Google it. You could just Google METAR code AO2, and it'll tell you what it means is that the weather facility at McClellan can differentiate between different types of precipitation. So it can tell if it's snow, it can tell if it's rain, it can tell if it's mist or fog. If you go to Auburn, we We don't have an AO2, we have an AO1, which means it cannot tell the different types of precipitation. So whether it's raining or whether it's snowing, Auburn doesn't know. It's just like, hey, it's wet out here, I don't know why. But McClellan's a little bit more, I'm just gonna say it's more well-funded, so it has better equipment. This is an uncommon thing, you're not gonna see this very often, but it just so happens to be up there right now. So it's PWINO, so it means present weather information not available. What that's referring to is right now, McClellan cannot tell the different types of precipitation. I don't know why. It could be a maintenance issue. It could just be simple as that. It's like it just needs some maintenance. And sometimes what you'll see also is you'll see a little dollar sign at the end of the report of the METAR, which is another way of saying, hey, this thing needs maintenance, it needs to be fixed, you need to put money into it. So you might see that too. I don't know, it's been there for a couple months, I don't know why. But that's the METAR. And again, ForeFlight decodes it for you, and it also adds the extra information on humidity and density altitude. And this is 25 minutes ago. We also have a TAF at McClellan, issued by a person. Again, it decodes it for you. But just so you guys know, 14th of the month, this was issued at 17:30 Zulu, aka 10:30. 10:30 today. And it's good for the 14th of the month, starting at 1800 Zulu, / the 15th of the month, 1800 Zulu. So it's good until tomorrow at 11 a.m. Variable at 4, P6SM means +6 statute miles visibility, so it's more than 6. And then SKC, sky clear. And then from the 14th of the month at 2100, the winds will be 200 at 9. Visibility will still be +6, but the clouds, it'll be few at 250, which just means 25,000 feet. I'm not worried about it. Clouds are at 25,000 feet. Okay, yeah, you're fine. From the 15th of the month at 0500 Zulu, the winds will change to 160 at 10. Still +6 statute miles, still few at 250. And again, it breaks it down. So you have today at 11, and then today at 2 p.m., and then today at 10 p.m. So the weather changes throughout the day, which is normal. And you can see it says today at 10, it expires tomorrow at 11. Another thing I like to go into, which I won't spend too much time on it, but I like to hit the forecast discussion, because this is what the actual meteorologist is writing. And there's an aviation one. So it says VFR conditions over the interior NorCal. Next 24 hours, surface wind mainly at or below 12 knots, except vicinity of Delta. So like vicinity of the Sacramento River. Southwesterly surface wind up to 20 knots possible after 0 Zulu on Sunday. 0 Zulu on Sunday is actually, so I hate explaining Zulu time. So 0 Zulu is the same thing as saying 2400 Zulu. So like 24 hours in a day, right? 2400 Zulu and 0 Zulu are the same. I use 24 because it's easier for me to do math. So 0 Zulu, 24 minus 7. So what is that, 1700? So 1700 military time is 5 p.m. local. So, and it says Sunday. It's actually saying 5 p.m. on Monday. I know, it's horrible. But if the Zulu time begins with a 0, just know it's talking about the previous day. 0 Zulu is 5 p.m. on Saturday. So after 5 p.m. today, the winds are going to pick up in the area of the Delta. Otherwise, VFR conditions over the next 24 hours, which is great. That's what you want. You want VFR. If it starts saying IFR, you might need to cancel your flight if it's, it's coming up. And then you could read like the extended discussion if you want. It's just kind of nice to have this because if you're looking at the charts on your own and you're trying to interpret all the TAFs and the METARs, it can get very overwhelming. I would rather just see what the meteorologist has to say about it and kind of go with what they're saying because they understand it more than I do. We already talked about prog charts, but here's some notes on it if you would like. Prog charts are like, they provide a big picture over the next 3 days of weather. And on your check ride, honestly, what might happen is your examiner will ask you like, hey, where do you get your weather from? And if you get it from ForeFlight, cool, you can say, I get it from ForeFlight. Where you're actually getting it from, though, if you're checking ForeFlight, because ForeFlight gets their weather from a place called 1-800-WEATHER-BRIEF. It's actually 1-800-WX-BRIEF. WX is just an abbreviation for weather. So ForeFlight gets its weather from 1-800-WX-BRIEF, which we will talk about. The GFA tool is the graphical forecast for aviation, and it's available on a website called aviationweather.gov. And I just put that on there so that you guys can go play with it on your own time. Aviationweather.gov. I will show it to you briefly. There's just different. I like using it if ForeFlight's not giving me what I want, but because you can see up to 15 hours in the future, 18 hours in the past, which is cool. Seeing in the past is useful because then you can kind of see if there's a trend. So here it is. And there's different, you can zoom in because otherwise it's just a mess. So like here's California. There's different layers over here that you can turn on. So like METAR, flight category dots. If it's green, it's VFR. If it's red, it's IFR. You can see fronts. So you kind of make it like a prog chart. And then you can, I think it's over here. Yeah, if you go over here, you can change like the type of information it shows. So like if there's any thunderstorms in the area, any place that's red, there's thunderstorms. So I do like this tool a lot just because of the imagery that they use. So here's icing. You can change the different altitudes you're at. So if you're only flying at 1,000 feet, most of this is all terrain, so you're probably not going to get any icing down here. But if you go up higher, maybe like 6,000 feet, you start seeing some areas where you can pick up ice. 9,000. It's pretty hot outside, so the freezing level is probably pretty high right now. So like you wouldn't start picking up ice. I guess NorCal until 18,000 feet. That's the GFA tool. Good to play with when you start getting into your cross-country stuff. But ultimately, ForeFlight does kind of give you everything that you need. But you should always expand your options. Like I was talking about ForeFlight, what we were just looking at. ForeFlight gets weather from 1-800-WX-BRIEF, so it is a legitimate source for aviation weather. There's like, I think it's an advisory circular that the FAA said that it's completely legal to use. So your examiner can't hem and haw at it. It's legal. The FAA said it was legal to just get a weather brief from ForeFlight. Because what people used to do is we used to call someone and talk to a person. You would literally dial 1-800-WX-BRIEF and talk to a briefer. You would tell them all sorts of information. You would tell them, here's my name, here's my tail number, type of airplane I'm flying, here's my route, here's my altitude, here's my planned airspeed, here's how long I'm going to be in the air, here's how much fuel I'm going to have on board. And if you're calling them between 6 and 48 hours prior to your flight, you would ask for an outlook briefing. They would give you a very general idea of what the weather is going to start looking like. And you know, I have the table up here, but it's a very general overview. If you want more specifics, you call them within 6 hours for a standard briefing. And I have all the elements included on the standard briefing in the next slide. And then as soon as practical before flight, if there, let's say he was like, hey, there might be a thunderstorm over your destination airport within the next 3 hours. Okay, I'll keep an eye out. Maybe like you pre-flighted, you're about to get in the plane, you call them up again. Hey, can I get an abbreviated briefing? I just want to ask about that thunderstorm you saw over my destination. Is it still there? Is it still developing? It's really just to give you an update on a specific part of your briefing if you get the abbreviated briefing. Most of us call and get a standard briefing. All the information regarding a weather briefing is in Advisor Circular 9192. This used to be how we get all of our weather information, as we talk to a briefer. Because what's nice is they break down everything. They tell you, you have a low pressure system in this area. With it is going to bring in some, we got a tropical storm down south, and you got that low pressure area, so it's really bringing in the moisture from that tropical storm. And that's why we're expecting rain for the next few days. Like, they interpret the whole big picture. And when in doubt, if you're looking at ForeFlight, you're looking at aviationweather.gov, you cannot make sense of the information, you can still talk to them. They still exist. And you can be like, hey, I'm a student pilot planning this flight, blah, blah, blah. If you can't remember all the information they need, just be like, let me know what information you need, I will give it to you. And then they'll start asking, okay, well, what's your tail number? What kind of plane are you flying? Where are you going? How long are you going to be in the airport? They'll ask you, they'll walk you through it. It's literally like a free ground lesson on weather, talking to a briefer, so I highly, highly, highly recommend talking to them at least once with your CFI. Here's the standard briefing stuff that they ask for. Type of flight plan, VFR, IFR, obviously VFR for you guys. Aircraft identification, aircraft type, departure point, route of flight, destination. Because your route of flight, you could be going from if you're going from McClellan to Monterey. You could go from McClellan to Modesto, then to Monterey. They want to know that because they'll give you the weather over Modesto as well. Your destination, altitudes you're going to be at, your estimated time of departure, ETD, and your estimated time en route, ETE. And then the type of information they'll give you adverse conditions. They'll tell you if there's any reports of like severe turbulence or icing, thunderstorms. They'll tell you if VFR flight's not recommended. If they say that, I wouldn't go. That, just because they say that doesn't mean you can't go. It's not like a legal thing, but you have to think about if you end up going and something happens to you, what will the NTSB report say? It's gonna say that you got a weather briefing. They're gonna talk to the briefer and be like, hey, you spoke to this pilot. He's gonna be like, or she's gonna be like, yeah, I told them VFR flight was not recommended. That's gonna look bad on you. They'll give you a synopsis. They'll talk about pressure areas. They'll talk about air masses. They'll talk about fronts. They'll talk about the current conditions. Hey, it's raining over there right now, but it's supposed to stop raining in about half an hour if you want to wait or delay your flight. They'll talk about your en route forecast and your destination forecast. Like, well, in about 2 hours after you take off, it's not looking too good. Or, hey, it's going to start clearing up. You might want to delay your flight because the forecast for your route is supposed to get better. Winds aloft means your winds at different altitudes. So the wind at the surface can be different than the wind at 5,000 feet. And that'll affect if you have a tailwind or a headwind on the way there. So that helps you with fuel planning purposes. If you're going to have a tailwind, you'll get there faster, which is great. If you have a headwind, it's going to take you a little bit longer. It's going to take you a little bit more fuel. And they'll tell you any NOTAMs in the area. So NOTAMs, notices to air missions, used to be called notices to airmen, which just means any updates at your airport that you're leaving or your airport that you're going to, any changes in airspace or air traffic control, or instrument procedure is not relevant to you, but that is what they're used for. They just provide general updates that you should know. Taxiway closures, runway closures, tower closures. SAC exec right now, their towers open at random days, so they have a couple NOTAMs saying like, hey, we're closed from this time to this time, Sunday through Thursday, but we're open this time to this time, Friday through Saturday. So they have NOTAMs for that. More information in the AIM, Chapter 7, Section 1. I think it's paragraph 4.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Would you say that ETD and ET?
Oh, ETD was estimated time of departure, and then ETE was estimated time en route. Oh, on the weather breaker stuff, I think if you, there's also a website, 1-800-weatherbrief.com. Make an account, because like now they want you to make an account like with your phone number, because otherwise if you call and you don't make an account, you can still get access to it, but it has to go through like a really long menu, and if you want to skip the menu, they'll just be like, oh, you have an account. They can just get you right to a briefer. They're very nice people, and they don't have a lot to do, so they want to talk to you. Let them know you're a student though, just so they can clarify some extra information. Obviously other places you can get weather, all of our phones have weather apps, and they're actually pretty good now. Like they're a lot better than what they used to be, so like you could look at that. I wouldn't depend on just that for a weather briefing, but it does give you, you know, a general idea of what the weather is like right now. Obviously you could watch the news, which none of us like to do. You could watch like, you know, the weather part of the news, because the meteorologist is going to tell you and walk you through like the low pressure, the high pressure, all the fronts and stuff. They're going to use all those terms. It'll help you understand it a little bit more, and also understand how to interpret it a little bit better, because they're literally going to tell you. So as pilots, you become like a meteorologist, you become a lawyer, you become a mechanic, all sorts of things. You wear all sorts of hats. Anyone have any blank spots on their little worksheets that you want to ask about before I ask about the review?
Standard pressure is 8.5 inches of mercury, or
299.2. The 8.5 thing, that was just what the airliners set the cabin pressure altitude to, or the cabin pressure to. But 299.2 is like the standard pressure at sea level.
is that the millibars?
The 8.5,
The 299.
that's inches of mercury.
Oh.
Millibars is 1013.
We measure pressures in inches of mercury or
Millibars. And again, you really won't see millibars a whole lot other than like on the prog charts. Alright, what causes the weather? Yeah.
uneven heating from the sun.
Correct, it does. Causes a different temperature, then different pressure, therefore different weather. What causes pressure variations? Feel free to shout it if you know it.
Altitude, temp, and water vapor.
Correct. Why do we care about those three things? That's kind of a correlation question. I don't think I said this. I didn't say the direct answer to this, but if you can kind of correlate that information and interpret an answer. So remember hot, high, and humid. Why do we care about those?
Because it changes how like the plane will be, like the height of it, like the pressure, like
Yeah, pressure does affect the height, and then the hot, high, humid thing, it also affects the plane's performance. So if it's hot, high, or humid, airplane performance decreases. What are the ingredients for a thunderstorm? Yeah.
instability, lifting, moisture.
Correct. Instability, lifting, and moisture. You need all three to get a thunderstorm. And what is wind shear, and why do we care?
Sudden change in wind speed direction.
Yeah, wind speed or direction. Why do we care as pilots? Just in general, it can affect your takeoff and your landing to the point where you can't recover from it. So, it can put you in a very bad situation during a very critical phase of flight. So, takeoff and landing are the critical phases of flight. That's just because you're the lowest to the ground. You're at a pretty slow airspeed for takeoff and landing, and you're very busy. You have a lot of distractions. So, most crashes in general aviation, I think just in aviation in general, happen during the takeoff and the landing phase. So to have an extra element of danger with wind shear, it's another ball to juggle. And if you're juggling a whole bunch of balls and you drop one, you normally drop the rest of them too. So takeoff and landing, it's a juggling act. as you start, as you get further into your training, your CFI is gonna throw you more to juggle. So at first, you might just be juggling 2. You might just be juggling like, using the yoke and the rudder. Okay, your CFI has their hand on the throttle for you. And then eventually the next lesson, they're like, okay, now you got the throttle, you got the yoke, and you have the rudders. Okay, now you're juggling 3. But they're gonna help you with like some crosswind correction if needed. But then as you get better, they're like, okay, you got a, I don't know, a 5-knot crosswind from your right. That's a 4th ball. Now you're juggling all 4. Now you're on the radios. Now you gotta do the radio calls. That's 5 balls juggling. You're doing a lot of, you're dividing your attention between a lot of different things during takeoff and landing. So that's the part where you need to pay most attention. That's the part where if you fly with non-pilot passengers, or just passengers in general, even pilots, we need a reminder sometimes. You tell them to shut up because you are busy and you've got a lot going on. And you don't need them chatting about, nonsense things while you're busy. That was a long tangent. Where are we? What are some indications of atmospheric instability that we can observe? I think that was that slide with windy tree.
The temp change with height.
Yeah. If you have a faster than normal standard lapse rate, so instead of 2 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 feet, now it's 4 degrees Celsius every 1,000 feet. That's an indication of instability because you're having a rapid temperature drop, and therefore you're going to get a pressure drop with that. Some other ones would be clouds with extensive vertical development, like cumulus clouds, cumulonimbus as well. What was that? It was the clouds. Precipitation, thank you. Yes. You have rain, especially if it's showery rain, not like constant, steady drizzle, but like showery, like every, just randomly starts pouring for 5 minutes and then it stops. That's unstable. And why do we establish personal minimums? This is kind of you can answer it in your own way. There's not really a yes or right or wrong.
To like add your own personal boundaries to like keep yourself safe.
Yeah, just to keep yourself safe, just to keep yourself alive. The FAA does their best. The law is the bare minimum, really. I hate to say that, but it is. The law is, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's safe. So it's up to you to use your own common sense and to use your own experience to pull from, and your CFI. Your CFI is going to tell you stories and it's going to scare the crap out of you, and then you're going to be like, God, I'm never going to do that. How do you never put yourself in that situation? By giving yourself personal minimums. And you might not have a really good idea of what those would be, and that's totally fine. I don't expect you to know that right now. As you get closer to soloing, that's when that kind of starts coming up. And then especially when you get to the level of like having your check ride, because when you're gonna go take your private pilot check ride, the assumption is that you're gonna pass. We're all assuming you're gonna pass, otherwise we wouldn't sign you off. The examiner is assuming that you're here because you're ready and that you're gonna pass, and you're gonna treat them as if they're not there. So they're supposed to be just an observer. They're not there as a pilot to help you. They're not a passenger. They're just there. They're gonna be quiet, and they're gonna let you run through everything. They're gonna tell you like, okay, let me see a power off stall, for example. But they're not gonna tell you how to do it. They're not gonna tell you the airspeeds to hold. That's all up to you to know how to do and how to do it safely. And so the idea is you're gonna pass and you're gonna go off and you're gonna go fly with loved ones and with friends. You're gonna take out people and you're gonna be a responsible pilot because you're gonna have your personal minimums already established and you're gonna have them written down and you're gonna sign it as if it was a contract. And the reason why you're signing that and you're having them written down is because you're treating yourself as a company. I'm a company, I'm in charge of the plane, I'm in charge of all these passengers and their lives, and I'm going to treat this flight as such, even if you're just flying in the traffic pattern. Traffic pattern is probably the most dangerous place to be, honestly. So if you're flying somewhere, taking your mom, taking your dad, or whoever, you're just taking them to lunch. There's already an inherent risk in that flight, no matter how short it is. Just the takeoff alone is deadly, the landing alone is deadly. So you have the personal minimums, and you we all do our best to not be influenced by people who might try to push us into an uncomfortable situation. I doubt any of your friends or family would do that, because otherwise they shouldn't be your friends. But there are people, you know, and you have your own internal things that are happening where it's like, well, I've been planning this flight for like a month now, and it's just a little bit too windy. It's a little bit outside of my comfort zone, but I really want to make the flight happen, and you know, the wind's variable, so it's probably fine. If you don't have the warm and fuzzy feeling, if you're not 100% sure, then you just don't go. And sometimes it sucks. Like, I get it, it does suck. Just recently, I had a flight where, out of Auburn, I was planning a group flight for everybody. We were supposed to go fly to Petaluma to go have breakfast, and I was gonna meet my family there. But the fog just wasn't burning off in time. It usually burns off around 9:45, but everybody was kind of getting antsy and just wanted to get going. So I couldn't make it about me. I couldn't be like, hey, well, let's just wait for the fog to burn off, or let's just take off now, I'm sure it'll be fine, because I live there, so like I know when it's gonna burn off. I couldn't have that internal pressure force everyone else into an uncomfortable position, so we just diverted. We went somewhere else. So I had that pressure of like, I told my family I was gonna meet them there at a certain time, and it was gonna be really cool and really fun. But even now, like, I still feel that pressure to make flights happen, and you just have to remember, like, what's the NTSB report gonna say? What's the safest decision? Would I, and like for me, I'm like, would I send a student out there? No, I wouldn't. I would never put a student in an uncomfortable position like that. So why would I put these other people in a position? Why would I put myself in a position of being unsure and making a flight that I was not 100% positive would be safe? So yeah, we ended up going to, we went to Red Bluff because it's just a lot easier to get into there. It's in the valley, there's no fog. So we ended up changing the destination, and that's okay. And that kind of stuff is gonna happen throughout your training, throughout your career, or if it's not a career, just your flying experience in general. So that's all I have for weather. There's so much more about weather. So I will send this. I will send a link to that advisory circular that I kept referring to. And yeah, I implore you to keep learning about weather, because it's just a forever kind of topic. There's always more to know about it. I encourage you to like talk to other pilots too, because a lot of the time you talk about weather, somebody has a story. They're like, oh, let me tell you about the time. Any questions? Good? Okay.